the view that consciousness is fundamental is idealism, which hasn't really been popular in Britain since 1925. And that's partly because, partly because of the two wars, the world wars, right? There was a real anti-German sentiment after the wars for good reason at the time. And Germans were generally associated with idealism because, especially through a philosopher,
I didn't know
Hegel.
that.
Yeah, Hegel. So, well, let me. I try to situate this historically, and it's very fascinating. And I'm still looking into this. I mean, it's multifaceted, but it's quite so. Let's say over 200 years ago, late 1700s, Immanuel Kant brought about this, what he called Copernican revolution in philosophy, right? Where he put mind at the center of things. And he said, listen, our knowledge is really limited because we have to perceive the world, including ourselves, in this particular way where we project things to understand things. Like I said, we project colors and sounds, but also space and time and causality as well. And even when we think about ourselves, we have got this limited way we project even upon ourselves. So we don't really even know our minds. My master's dissertation was on this, actually, the limits of self-consciousness in Kant and Schiller. Anyway, that philosophy was extremely influential. And even today, when you think about predictive processing theories of consciousness, I mean, this has got a Kantian origin. There's an essay on that, I think. There is an essay on that, actually, tracing that origin. So, this kind of more materialist today, that the brain produces the world that we see. And Alan Seth is kind of TED talk about that and whatever. But it's Kantian, essentially. Transcendental idealism, it's called, or critical idealism. Anyway, historically, what happened is there was this kind of wish by these Germans, like Fichte, Schelling, and then Hegel, to say, actually, no, the implication of Kantianism is we don't know the world in itself, because to know means to project, right? So there was this, I would say, burning desire in Germany, what is now Germany, Jena especially, to say, no, we can know what the world is like in itself, right? And the culmination of this thought was Hegel. And he was a dialectical idealist. So he still believed that mind was fundamental, but that we did know what the world is in itself, and that because that world in itself is mental, just like we are, right? So it's a kind of pantheism. He denied he was a pantheist, but it's a type thereof, really. Anyway, Hegel was extremely influential. His philosophy was very influential. It also kind of justified the Prussian state. And famously, it really inspired Karl Marx, who then had a massive effect on Western thought and politics. But he turned the dialectical idealism into a dialectical materialism. That's a sort of radical metaphysical shift. But nonetheless, Hegel had a big influence on intellectual thought in the English-speaking world as well, with British idealism, and in America with the transcendentalists. And, like Nietzsche said, without Hegel, there'd be no Darwin. So Hegel's had this view of reality, which was a kind of progression, like we are progressing in society for logical reasons. And so you had a sort of basic evolutionary thought there that we are still in. And but nonetheless, this kind of idealism that Hegel was pushing, and that became very common, was linked to German philosophers. And then with the advent of the First and Second World Wars, there was a huge shift away from any kind of German thinking, because arguably it led to the war. I mean, Fichte was was an idealist, became a German nationalist, really, and wrote a book about it. And Karl Popper criticized Hegel heavily for being sort of leading to fascism and so on. So, I mean, this is debatable. I think it's unfair. But anyway, there was this sentiment. And so there was this push against idealism completely. And then materialism seeped through. So that was through the Marxism that I mentioned. And you get that in academia with critical theory. It turned into critical theory and so on. But then in the analytic world, there was a push against Hegelism generally. So in the early 20th century, A.J. Ayer wrote an essay on the meaninglessness of metaphysics. Metaphysics was generally idealist then. And then of course, we stopped teaching it really at university, metaphysics. Idealism was never logically refuted, but it became unfashionable, right? And so we moved on, and then people were not trained in metaphysics. I mean, scientists originally, like Humphrey Davy, for example, who He wrote, published a book in 1800, Nitrous Oxide. He considered himself a chemical philosopher. So, and the greatest scientists have always been interested in philosophy, like Einstein and Heisenberg and Schrödinger and so on. But generally, there was not much love for it. And it became a dirty word, metaphysics. And as a result, the 20th century and sort of all the brain sciences, neurosciences there, and generally all the sort of special sciences just moved away from metaphysics, except for one metaphysics. That's materialism. That's still a metaphysical point of view. And that was just assumed to be true. But, interestingly, there are a few philosophers of materialism, but it's debatable. It's very debatable. There's a lot of problems with it, just like all of them do. But that was one of the reasons why, like you said, you just assume that, the brain produces consciousness. And that the question is, like, how does it do that, right? This is, but it's, you could go further and say, well, does it actually produce it, or is it, or does it receive it? If you go into even like more radical theories, right, from Bergson and so on. Or is the brain and the mind on an equally fundamental level? So neither produces the other, but they are both, like I said, expressions of something deeper still. All of these questions are still logically open. They haven't been determined, right? And so, like, I suppose I've just found, like, one of my roles of life has become to just like offer this metaphysical menu of possibilities, right?
And I love it.
This
I
is
think
not
the history is so interesting, because I'd be completely put up my hands up and say I'm very ignorant to the history of philosophy. Again, my orientation is generally just biology and more hard science rather than the philosophy. So I'm learning so much. I didn't know any of that history. I think that's very, very interesting.
Yeah, no, it is interesting. I mean, the history becomes important for understanding science as well, and the
Yes.
hypothesis, the experiments one does, like they're based on like these deep, implicit, unspoken of metaphysical theories that are basically, they might be right. I'm not saying they're wrong, right? I'm just saying that they're open to question.
Yes.
And by questioning them, you can come up with new theories about, the mind. I mean, for example, why do we always only scan the brains when we're looking at consciousness, or not the whole body? There's this assumption of neuroessentialism generally, for example.
I completely agree with that, actually. That's one thing that's that's shifted for me throughout the podcast. Basically, since I spoke to Michael Levin, I think that I think the brain is maybe necessary for a particular complexity, a particular richness of consciousness. But I'm totally on board with, like, my kidney cells are conscious, the cells in my toes are conscious. They all make meaningful use of information in the environment and disambiguate noisy, complex information, self-generate their own meaning. I'm like on board that, my pancreas has subjectivity. I totally, I think I used to be very much, the brain creates consciousness. You just get a certain level of intricacy and complexity, and then consciousness emerge. I don't think that's logically very consistent at all. We have the most complex part of our brain is the cerebellum at the back, and doesn't seem to be involved in consciousness at all. I think that's a really interesting point of fact against just like this emergentism. But I'm like fully on board with, like, very, very, very early on, biological systems evolved consciousness, like extremely primitive systems. But I'm still not quite more radical than that. Like I think you would take a couple of steps more radical than that. And that's what I'm really curious in understanding why. I think I've also... Sorry, go.
Sounds like you're almost a panpsychist then. I mean, you're probably what I'd call a biopsychist, right?
But I would say, like, I think instead of saying that, fundamental particles and the universe have subjective experience, I do think that subjective experience and consciousness emerges early on in the integration of an organism's state in relation to its environment, and then integrating that environmental stimulus in relation with its own memory. Like, last time I moved towards this stimulus, I got food, so I fed myself. That's great, but I'm sensing this other chemical over here, and there's a predator, so I have to integrate those two signals together, and I'm integrating with the memory that I have of those two signals, plus my own body's state. Like, I think consciousness is a biological control system fundamentally, and
right. In which case, you believe in mental causation, then, right? Because it has to do something, otherwise it wouldn't exist, right?
Absolutely. Yeah,
reasons.
I don't buy this epiphenomenon nonsense. That may never make
Yeah.
doesn't make any sense to me.
So, like, if you believe in emergent mental causation, downward causation, then that causes this massive problem with upward causation as well, that emergence, which is made clear in something called the exclusion problem. We could talk about, but yeah, okay. Let's. So, yeah, I mean, so are you an integrated information theorist then? I guess is what you're
So I
saying.
really like aspects of it. I really consciousness just being integrated information, I think is great. I think that I like that a lot. I don't think I fully understand the everything that that theory states, but I
Right.
like the idea that consciousness is integrated information. I've always been on board with that, and the fact that you can maybe measure it with this number called phi is super interesting. And they're trying to work out different ways of quantifying consciousness based on how integrated the information is. I think there's a lot of really promising stuff
Yeah.
there. Am I on board with it completely? I guess I would say that I don't understand it fully to say that or not.
And there's different versions every year, more or less, So even if you understood it now, and next year there'll be a new version of it. But okay, generally speaking, yeah. So yeah, I mean, I don't think we're that far apart then, really. But I'll say, let's talk about, like, okay, so integrated information generally. So a cell has it, and so on. In the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead, who's sort of founder of process philosophy, also his theories are the origin really of epigenetics for metaphysical reasons. But his philosophy is called the philosophy of organism because essentially he argues there's no real distinction between an organism and an inorganic entity like a molecule, right? There's no cutoff point. So when you talk about, like, a cell can sort of integrate information, amoeba cell perhaps, or something like that. How about, like, a protein molecule within a neuron cell? The kinesin, is it pronounced kinesin? The ones that walk on
Yes,
tubes.
yeah.
I mean, they also react to the environment. They activate, things like this, right? And when you look at them, animations of them, they look like little guys walking along, right? Don't they?
Yeah,
Even, right?
yeah.
But anyway, just to finish my point, so that's a molecule, and we have so-called organic molecules. But the cutoff point between an organic molecule and let's say a non-organic molecule is really arbitrary, it seems. So because a molecule also kind of reacts to the environment and maintains itself in itself, perseveres in itself, and tries to reach a state of equilibrium and so on. Okay, it doesn't reproduce and so on, but nonetheless, it has self-sufficient structure to it to a certain extent, and so if you're attributing consciousness to very basic life forms, why not go further? Where would the cutoff point be?
Yeah,
This would
it's
this
a
would be an
great it's absolutely. No, it's a great question, and I'm super glad that I've been really interested in this, where exactly the cutoff point is, and I don't have a good answer for it. I really don't. Like, I think the earliest way I think about how something integrates a signal is that it probably operates on like a rule based heuristic, like move towards sun, good, and then we'll always do that. And eventually, rule based becomes non rule based, and that's like a vague continuum. And I don't have a good answer on like necessarily one after the other, 'cause
well,
it
I don't
just,
think anyone else,
but I think
but
it's super interesting.
it is, isn't it? And but the thing is, if you kind of imagine that organisms go all the way down, as it were, this is Leibniz's old view as well, really. Then why not just grant consciousness all the way down as well? If things are integrated all the way down, even at the atomic level, why not attribute a very basic form of consciousness to that?
Well,
Why?
does an electron,
So why must there be a cutoff point? This is the interesting question.
so panpsychism says that a singular electron is conscious, right? It has some level of mind.
Yeah, generally speaking, like, there are many types of panpsychism, but yeah, okay, I'll grant you that.
So what kind of, integrated signal and, subjectivity do you think a single electron is having?
Well, I mean, an electron, I don't think even physicists really understand what it is, so I'm not going to be careful what I say here, right?
Yes.
It's a wave and a particle, isn't it? I mean, and maybe that's just a model of it. But it does obviously sense the nucleus of an atom, doesn't it? The proton and the neutron. And it does react accordingly. And it will also react to streams coming in, electricity of other electrons, moving it on and so on, So it has got these rules, as you say, of interaction.
I guess I
But
just don't know enough about it. Yeah.
Yeah, the interesting thing is, nor do I, and the reason is neither of us are physicists, particle physicists, right? But I believe that even physicists at the basic level don't really understand, like
Yeah.
what, and there are physicists who differ with one another about it. And when you get into quantum physics, which I try to avoid at all costs, um, people just say if you think you understand it, you don't understand it, and also just the question of the issue of energy, what energy is. I mean, most physicists will say we don't know what it is. We can model it, put it into equations and stuff, but we don't know what it fundamentally is.
Yeah.
So the questions of consciousness really, are fully interwoven into questions of physics. Like to get out this question about how far down do you go? Well, then you need to know about these particular particles or these entities. And maybe in the future, we won't even have the concept of an electron. Maybe it will be superseded by something else.
Yes.
So you have to. I suppose we all have to kind of admit our limitations, understand that science does progress or change at least, and hopefully we'll get insights later on down the line. So that's why I kind of say I don't believe anything deeply, but I kind of entertain the idea. I think it's like if you say that consciousness exists throughout the universe and didn't emerge, you get rid of problems. Like I said, you get rid of this problem of like the emergence of consciousness from non-consciousness. This is a really big problem, and you get rid of these problems of upward and downward causation and things like this. It's nothing. I mean, it's nothing really. I don't think it's that radical at all. It's just a belief in evolution, at all levels. And also, just one other aspect of all this, which I started with, the concept of matter. Electrons supposed to be a part of matter. We don't really know what matter is. Like I said, same matter energy is supposed to be the same thing, and we don't really understand what it is. So we have to be humble, and then so we have to understand that we can't know that consciousness emerges out of non-consciousness.
Yes.
Because we can't know that there is something non-conscious fundamentally. So that's why I think all the options are open, and then you have to go. If people push you like you're pushing me, then you have to you can take a position and defend it, but you can never be certain about it.
I guess I think I've always somewhat conflated panpsychism and idealism. Like, is maybe differentiate those two? Like, does panpsychism make the argument that consciousness is fundamental, or just that everything is conscious?
Yeah, the latter.
Yes.
So
So it's not a consciousness as fundamental theory.
it can be, but it doesn't need to be. So I've
Right.
got this 2023 paper called On the Need for Metaphysics and Psychedelic Therapy and Research. And in it, there's a metaphysics matrix. So it's got it's got columns of physicalism, dualism, idealism, monism, and the transcendent, but then a row of panpsychism cutting across, because panpsychism can be any of those. It's kind of
Right.
like, it wears many guises. So you do get idealist versions of panpsychism, for example, from Schopenhauer. But you also get physicalist versions of panpsychism. So Galen Strawson, who was actually my PhD examiner, he's someone who really pushed panpsychism into the public eye, I think, about 15, 20 years ago, because he was like hard-nosed analytic British philosopher. His father was a famous philosopher, Peter Strawson, and he suddenly argued for this identity form of panpsychism, but he calls it real materialism. And he says a complete naturalist. And he even argues that this is what materialism used to be. And actually, you do find it with Francis Bacon, people like that, like originators of the scientific age. So you get material. So he just says, no, I'm a pure materialist. I just believe that matter has elements of consciousness within it. So it's just one more feature, like charge or spin. So you can define yourself that way. You can get dualist panpsychists as well. So in a way, every entity has a kind of like a psyche attached to it, as it were, which doesn't depend on the body. This is rare, though, and perhaps this is more akin to how we understand animism, from the Americas. Like, tree has a spirit, river has a spirit, and so on. And then there are idealist versions. So everything is a mind, and the whole of reality is mental. But this is, a view of Leibniz, for example, arguably, but it's not necessary. And then you get like the monist version that I kind of prefer, which is that, mind and matter are both expressions of something more fundamental, but that means that every manifestation of matter has to have this parallel mentality to it. That's kind of, panpsychism, but it's not mind and matter are not fundamental to reality. They're both expressions of something deeper still that we don't understand. And also, I should say, panpsychism is often confused with pantheism, which is the view that all is God. So this is the view upwards, as it were. So that's the view that there's a cosmic consciousness. The whole universe has this kind of basic background radiation consciousness. Not a personal God. So it's not. Spinoza says God does not love you, right? God doesn't care about you in this kind of pantheism, or cosmopsychism is another word for it today, really. But you can be a panpsychist and not a cosmopsychist. So you can think that, yes, like you were saying, you need entities with integrated information like organisms for consciousness. But, the cosmos doesn't have that as a whole. So we begin at the highest level would be human or alien or whatever exists out there. But some kind of biological organism would be the highest view, and then you go down. Whereas
Yeah.
cosmopsychists say, no, this is just on a rung on the ladder to the ultimate cosmic consciousness, and we are parts of that. But that's not panpsychism necessarily. You can be both, but you don't have to be.
I didn't know that there were so many flavors to it. I think I remember having my one lecture in consciousness in my entire neuroscience degree, and I think panpsychism was given maybe a 3-minute monologue on there's no evidence for it, don't even look at it. Like, I actually remember my professor kind of saying very much along those lines, like it was not given even remotely the time of day.
That's kind of sad, I think. But also, I must say, when I was a philosophy undergraduate and postgraduate, same. We were told this is almost like if your theory reaches panpsychism, that's disproof of the theory. That's reductio ad absurdum, right? So, we were never taught the history of it. But there are historical reasons for that. Like I mentioned, with regard to the war, a lot of the idealists were more sympathetic to panpsychism. But there's another big factor that I sort of hinted at the beginning, which is the Reformation. So, the Western world, in the early 1500s, we went through the Reformation with Luther, against the Roman Catholic Church, and this led to, Lutheranism, Calvinism, but also the extreme form was Puritanism, and the Puritans wanted to, and which by the way became big in America. They were kind of shunned from England and Britain, but they set up a home in America. But this is what the Puritans wanted to do, and a number of Protestants really, is to get rid of any pagan elements within Christianity. And they thought Roman Catholicism had integrated many pagan elements. Ronald Hutton argues this as well. He says paganism survived through medieval Christianity. They didn't just reject it; they just assimilated it into the religion. But the reformers, they wanted to get rid of all elements of paganism from church. And so what they did is they even saw the Aristotelianism, which is not quite panpsychism, but it's, there's a vegetative soul and so on, right, in Aristotle. They wanted to get rid of all of those pagan elements, all of these old European animist elements. So there was, there's a spirit to the tree and so on. And just say that we only go by the Bible, right? Sola Scriptura. Nothing else is true. So they got rid of all that mentality within nature. And then, next century, Descartes comes along and says, actually all of nature is completely unensouled. There's no consciousness in it at all. In fact, only humans have consciousness. That's through the soul, right? And this was very influential. So then the church took care of the soul, saving the soul, and what became science took care of nature, but now understood in from this Protestant perspective of being devoid of consciousness. And this is actually an early Christian bifurcation of nature, which Descartes crystallized, but it had, he was actually a Roman Catholic, but nonetheless, that was the zeitgeist. And this is one of the reasons I think why probably in neuroscience today, you just sort of look at panpsychism for a few minutes and then move on quickly.
The Giant Shoulder mission is to explore radical ideas in biology, neuroscience, and consciousness, and elevate those stories to the highest possible level while keeping them accessible to everyone. If this interests you and you want to support independent science, then please consider subscribing to the Clips channel. Check out our 26 Neuroscience book. You can download it for free